Clarence Thomas had spent decades staying out of the spotlight. But on this Thursday morning, his silence was about to be shattered, because Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was ready to put him on trial. The hearing wasn't supposed to be historic. It was just another congressional oversight meeting, the kind that normally passed unnoticed. Low viewership, low expectations. Room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building was known more for its formality than fireworks. But today, something was different. The cameras were already rolling. Journalists leaned forward, alert, and one name on the witness list had every reporter sitting up straighter. Justice Clarence Thomas. He'd been called to testify about judicial ethics, a subject that had dogged the Supreme Court for months after bombshell reports exposed his alleged undisclosed luxury vacations, private jets, and high-end gifts. Normally, stories like this sparked a few headlines and faded away. But not this time. By 10 a.m., nearly every major network was live-streaming the session. When Jasmine Crockett's name was called, no one blinked. She calmly adjusted her microphone. Her tone wasn't combative. She even smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile that puts people at ease. It was the kind that said, "I've been waiting for this moment." She began softly, measured, almost respectful. "Justice Thomas, thank you for being here today. I'd like to walk through a few items that have raised public concern. Not speculation, not innuendo, just facts." Thomas nodded politely, shoulders relaxed. He'd faced tough questions before, but Crockett didn't give him time to settle. "Since 2001, she said, you've reportedly accepted gifts and trips from billionaire Harlan Crow totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. Private jets, yacht vacations, real estate transactions, is that accurate?" A ripple of tension moved through the room. Thomas leaned toward the mic. "Those were personal friendships, Congresswoman. Long-standing relationships." Crockett didn't miss a beat. Her voice stayed gentle, but her words cut deep. "The concern isn't who your friends are, Justice Thomas. It's whether a sitting Supreme Court justice should accept gifts of that magnitude without disclosing them, especially when those same individuals have cases or political influence tied to the law." Thomas hesitated. The pause was heavy. The committee chair tapped his pen. Someone coughed in the gallery. Crockett didn't blink. She locked eyes with him, steady, surgical. Each question landed harder than the last. "Justice Thomas, did you ever recuse yourself from a case where Harlan Crow had a financial interest?" Another pause. Thomas shuffled his notes, clearing his throat. "I have always adhered to the rules and guidelines provided to me." Crockett leaned forward. "That wasn't the question. Did you ever recuse?" Exhale. "No, I did not find it necessary, and..." Just like that, the air shifted. Crockett placed her palms flat on the desk. "There are high school teachers in my district, Justice Thomas, who have to file financial disclosures more detailed than what we've seen from one of the most powerful figures in this democracy. How does that build public trust?" It wasn't a gotcha moment. It wasn't emotional, it was precise. One cut at a time. Viewers at home sat up straighter. Some hit rewind. Twitter started buzzing. Reporters whispered to each other. The longest-serving Supreme Court justice was under fire. And the person applying the pressure wasn't shouting or grandstanding. She was just asking questions. And the silence after each one spoke louder than his answers. But Crockett wasn't done. Not even close. The most explosive part hadn't even begun. She adjusted the paper in front of her, subtle, deliberate. The kind of move that says, "Watch closely." Thomas expected tough ethics questions. He wasn't new to criticism. But what came next felt less like a continuation, and more like a new trial starting. "Justice Thomas," Crockett said, her tone steady, "we've discussed your financial disclosures and or the lack thereof. But there's another aspect we haven't addressed, one that concerns the American people just as much." Thomas frowned slightly. Then Crockett dropped the name, Ginny Thomas. The room changed instantly. Tension rippled like a shockwave. You could see it in the faces of Thomas's aides, eyes darting between Crockett and the justice, like watching a chess match and realizing the king was cornered. Thomas glanced down at his hands, then back up. My wife is not the one being questioned here today. Crockett nodded calmly. That's correct. But her actions, particularly her involvement in efforts to influence or undermine the 2020 election results, raise serious concerns about impartiality, and those concerns directly relate to your role on the court. She paused, then asked plainly, "Did you discuss any aspect of the 2020 election or its outcome with your wife, while she was in contact with individuals involved in attempts to overturn the results?" Thomas stared straight ahead, gripping the edge of the desk. "No," he said finally. "I did not discuss the details of any case with my wife." Crockett leaned back slightly, repeating softly, "Not any case. But did you discuss the outcome of the election with her?" Another pause. "That's a private matter," Thomas said. Without hesitation, Crockett replied, "That's not acceptable." "Because your wife," Crockett continued, her voice steady but cutting, "was texting with the White House Chief of Staff, urging him to overturn the election results. And meanwhile," she leaned in, letting the weight of her words settle, "you were the only justice who voted against releasing those communications to investigators. That's not private justice, Thomas. That's public accountability." Crockett flipped through a stack of documents, slow, deliberate, her tone sharpening as she began quoting. Line by line, March 24th, 2022, she read. Ginny Thomas texted, "Do not concede. It takes time for the army who is gathering for his back." She held up the page for the cameras to catch. "That message," she continued, "was sent while your wife had direct access to people at the very top of the administration, then pausing just long enough to let the silence breathe. Tell me, Justice Thomas, how can the public trust this court's impartiality when a sitting justice's spouse was this politically involved?" The room went dead silent. Even the usual shuffle of papers had stopped. Thomas didn't speak, and Crockett read the silence, like a confession. She leaned closer, her voice lower but sharper now. "I'm going to remind you of something, Justice Thomas. You are not just a man sitting behind a bench. You are 1/9 of a body that interprets the laws that govern every single person in this country. If there's even a hint that your household has access to political operations designed to subvert democracy, that isn't rumor. That's a threat to the entire system." Thomas finally spoke, but his words were soft, measured. "I respectfully disagree." Crockett arched an eyebrow. Her reply was quiet, but sharp enough to cut glass. "Respectfully," she echoed. "Disagreement isn't a defense when the facts are on the record." She leaned back slightly, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. No yelling. No slamming fists, no theatrics. Just words. And underneath them, something far more dangerous for Thomas. Because in just a few carefully measured questions, Crockett had drawn a direct line. From ethical negligence to political compromise, and the person she'd connected it to wasn't a lobbyist, wasn't a donor. It was his wife. Some committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A Republican congressman leaned in and whispered to the chair. The chair shook his head. No interruptions. Not yet, because the questions were real, and the country was watching. Hundreds of miles away in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a retired civics teacher named Nora Beasley watched from her living room. 33 years of teaching government. And, now, under her breath, she whispered, "This is what we should have been seeing all along." Across the country, the moment was spreading like wildfire. Group chats, live stream comments, newsrooms, even barbershops. For many, this wasn't just another hearing. It was someone finally saying the quiet part out loud. But Crockett wasn't finished. She knew this couldn't just be about impropriety. It had to point somewhere bigger. If you could connect the threads from ethics violations to influence over justice, then what else was tangled in that web? Just as Crockett prepared her next question, a low, authoritative voice cut through the air. "Madam Chair, point of order." The interruption landed like a blade. It was Congressman Bennett Rusk, Wyoming Republican, known for his sharp suits. Sharper tongue, and a long record of defending conservative power. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. "With all due respect to the Congresswoman," he began, "this is a hearing on judicial ethics, not a political witch hunt against spouses. This line of questioning is inflammatory. It's irrelevant." Crockett turned her head slowly, almost amused. She adjusted her mic, leaned slightly forward, and without raising her voice, replied, "With all due respect, Congressman, I'm, well, within the scope of ethics when we're talking about conflicts of interest that could affect national outcomes. If the spouse of a justice is influencing political actions, and the justice is ruling on cases related to those actions, that's not irrelevant. That's the definition of compromised." Rusk tried to push back, but before he could, Chair Repotts Halloran, an independent from Oregon, raised his hand. "She's within her time and scope. Let her continue." Just like that, Rusk leaned back, fuming. Crockett didn't even pause. She turned back to Thomas, and now he looked visibly tense, his fingers interlaced, knuckles white. This wasn't just uncomfortable for him. It was unfamiliar, because Clarence Thomas wasn't used to being questioned like this, especially not by someone who refused to be intimidated by his robe, his position, or his legacy. "Justice Thomas," Crockett said finally, holding up a printed email chain, "I want to read you something." She raised the paper slightly, letting the cameras lock in. "These are emails between Ginny Thomas and several state legislators in Arizona, encouraging them to reject the certified election results and appoint their own electors. That's not speculation. It's verified, it's public record." She lowered the papers slowly, letting them fall to the desk. "Were you aware of these emails before they became public?" Thomas inhaled deeply before answering. "No, I was not." "You never once discussed with your wife her involvement in trying to overturn a U.S. election?" "No, I did not." Crockett narrowed her gaze, voice steady but cutting. "That's interesting, because any other public official with that level of proximity to a coordinated political effort would be required to recuse themselves from any case even remotely connected. But you didn't recuse when the court was asked to hear election-related disputes." Thomas leaned toward the mic. "The court operates independently, Congresswoman." Crockett's response came instantly, each word clipped and deliberate. "I'm sure that's what you'd like the public to believe. But independence does not mean invisibility. You cannot operate in the dark and expect the people to trust that your decisions aren't tainted." Outside the chamber, journalists were typing furiously. Clips were already trending online. In a cafe in Santa Fe, 2 law students whispered over their laptops, "She's not letting up." Meanwhile, in Toledo, a former judge named Ramon Delacroix turned to his wife and said, outside the chamber, whispers were spreading, "He's in trouble." Back. Inside, Crockett leaned in, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "This isn't just about one case, or one election. This is about the very real perception that the highest court in this country is becoming untouchable and unaccountable." She paused, scanning the room, then locked eyes with Thomas. "You have lifetime tenure. You are shielded from most forms of discipline. But what you are not immune from is scrutiny. And right now, millions of Americans are watching, and they're wondering how deep this goes." Thomas said nothing. His silence no longer felt dignified. It felt strategic, calculated, defensive. Crockett took a slow breath, preparing to close her line of questioning. "Justice Thomas," she said evenly, "can you tell the American people why your household's involvement in one of the most volatile political moments in our history doesn't justify full transparency from this court?" Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it again. Before he could speak, the chair leaned forward. "Justice, your answer?" Thomas finally said, low and clipped. "I believe I've said all I can on the matter." Crockett nodded once, clicked her microphone off, and leaned back in her chair. The moment wasn't loud. There were no raised voices, no table pounding. But its weight hung heavy in the air, and not just in that room. Across the country, something was shifting. People weren't just watching the news. They were paying attention. By midday, more than 2.3 million people were tuned in live. By 4 p.m., Crockett's exchange was on a constant replay loop. Cable panels dissecting it, hashtags trending, op-eds being drafted, and legal teams quietly cross-checking court calendars. But not everyone in the room was ready to let this unfold quietly, because what came next threatened to push this hearing from controversy into a potential constitutional crisis. Congressman Bennett Rusk leaned forward again, but this time he wasn't alone. A few seats down, Representative Lowell Braddock of Idaho, gray-haired, stone-faced, and fiercely loyal to the court's conservative wing, pushed his mic button and cleared his throat with deliberate weight. "Madam Chair," he began, "this hearing is spiraling into an outright smear campaign. I move to strike the last 5 minutes of questioning from the record on the grounds that it mischaracterizes the witness and introduces unproven allegations against a private citizen who isn't even here to defend herself." The tension snapped tighter. Some of Crockett's younger staffers shifted nervously behind her. Unsure if this was just political theater or the beginning of a full shutdown, Crockett didn't blink. She reached for her mic, slow, deliberate. "Mr. Braddock, if you're suggesting that referencing a public investigation, widely reported by credible outlets, constitutes a smear, then I'd suggest you revisit the purpose of congressional oversight. We are not here to protect the comfort of the powerful." Braddock smirked, leaning back. "We're also not here to stage political theater for viral clips." Crockett smiled, faintly, but it wasn't warm. "I don't need viral clips, I need accountability, and frankly, it's long overdue." Before it escalated further, Chair Repotts Halloran stepped in, his gavel hovering. "Motion denied. Congresswoman Crockett's time has expired. We'll move to the next member." But no one in the room moved. Not really, because the energy had shifted. Crockett had pulled a thread others had only dared to tiptoe around for years. And now, those threads were beginning to unravel right on Clarence Thomas's face. Thomas looked drained. The bags beneath his eyes seemed deeper now. His hands, once folded neatly, fidgeted beneath the table. The next member, Representative D.D. Sloan of Michigan, began her questioning. But most people had tuned out. Even inside the chamber, eyes were still locked on Crockett. She sat back calmly, flipping through her notes with the precision of someone who wasn't finished yet, because she wasn't. By now, the hallway outside was swarming with cameras. Journalists texted updates. In real time, one MSNBC producer typed into a group chat, "Crockett just rewrote the rules of these hearings." But the power struggle was far from over. After 2 rounds of tamer questioning from other members, Congressman Rusk requested a procedural recess. "That to you," Chair hesitated, then allowed it. As the room cleared, Crockett stood, stretched, and walked quietly to the back of the chamber. A young female staffer trailed behind her, whispering, "They're rattled. Phones are blowing up. Fox just cut into live coverage." Crockett nodded once, replying simply, "Good, that means they're listening." Meanwhile, in the hallway, Rusk and Braddock huddled tightly with 2 of Thomas's legal aides. Their faces were tight, pale, serious. One aide muttered sharply, "She went too far. We need to call this out for what it is." Rusk's voice dropped low. "We need to regain control before she calls for recusal. Because if she does and the media grabs it, we'll have a real problem on our hands." This wasn't about courtroom consequences anymore. It was about public perception. Because Crockett hadn't just presented facts, she told a story, and millions were already buying into it. The calm before the next storm back in the chamber. Thomas sat alone at the witness table, for the first time in a very long time. He looked uncertain, not because he lacked answers, but because for the first time he understood the truth. The questions weren't going away. Crockett returned to her seat, silent, composed. Her expression unreadable, but clear enough for anyone watching closely, if they thought that was too far. They weren't ready for what came next, because she hadn't even touched Ginny Thomas's financial entanglements, the dark money networks, the connection to Leonard Leo, and the judicial lobbying machine that had quietly funneled influence from the shadows Not yet. But as the gavel fell and the session resumed, everyone in the room knew. The temperature had changed, and Jasmine Crockett was nowhere near finished. The gavel struck softly as the chair called the hearing back to order. But the quiet that followed wasn't calm. It was the kind of silence where everyone pretends things are back to normal. But everyone in the room knows they're not. Justice Clarence Thomas sat at the witness table, drained. His tie hung slightly crooked. The collar of his shirt felt tighter than ever. Whatever confidence he'd carried into the room that morning was gone. And Jasmine Crockett? She looked like she was just warming up. Her mic light blinked red. "With permission from the chair," she said smoothly, "I'd like to resume my questioning." Chair Halloran gave a short nod. "Proceed, Congresswoman." Crockett flipped open a folder, pulling out a single page. She didn't raise it for the cameras, just enough for Thomas to see what was coming. "This document," she began, "is a financial disclosure form from 2017. It lists income from a rental property, jointly owned by you and your wife. But according to ProPublica, that property was sold in 2014, and the transaction was never reported." Thomas shifted in his seat, leaning toward the mic. "I believe that was a clerical oversight," he said quickly. "Nothing intentional." Crockett leaned in slightly, her voice calm but unyielding. "Justice Thomas, it wasn't disclosed for 3 years. That's not a typo. That's a pattern, and we're not just talking about one property here. We're talking about 3 separate properties, all purchased by a prominent political donor." Thomas opened his mouth, but Crockett cut in before he could pivot. "I had been advised," he said carefully, "that disclosure was not necessary in that case." Crockett's tone sharpened. "Who advised you?" The pause that followed was too long. Thomas glanced at his counsel. No one said a word. Finally, he turned back to the mic. I don't recall the name." Crockett's expression didn't change, but her voice carried a razor edge. "You don't recall the name of the person who advised you not to report a financial transaction involving a political donor? That seems convenient." Thomas looked cornered now. His jaw clenched. His gaze dropped briefly toward the chair, then back to Crockett. "I've never tried to hide anything from the American people," he said quietly. Crockett shook her head slightly, her voice steady. "Justice Thomas, intent isn't what's being measured here. It's the effect, and the effect of hiding or failing to disclose transactions involving politically connected individuals undermines the very foundation of judicial neutrality." The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was telling. Even the usual defenders on the committee sat frozen in their seats. No one came to his rescue, because in that moment this wasn't about politics anymore. It was about credibility. Crockett had hit a nerve. Thomas fidgeted with his pen, murmuring softly. There was no corruption. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Corruption," she said evenly, "isn't always cash in a bag. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's patterns. It's knowing the rules and sidestepping them just enough to maintain power while avoiding responsibility." She paused, then delivered the line that landed like a gavel. "And in this case, Justice Thomas, that silence has gone on for decades." The room stilled again, but outside, the noise was growing louder. Clips from the hearing were already looping nonstop. TikToks, reels, cable segments. The phrase, "I don't recall the name," was trending nationwide. Media analysts were picking apart every answer, and every non-answer. In Miami, a political science professor named Ellis Darnell paused his lecture, wheeled a classroom TV to the front, and told his students, This is what real government tension looks like. Watch how fast public trust shifts in real time." Back in the chamber, Crockett closed her folder deliberately. "Madam Chair, I yield." Her questioning ended, at least for now. But the damage? Already done. Thomas had stumbled, and this wasn't the kind of stumble you walk back from. You could see it in his posture, the once straight shoulders now slightly slumped, his hand trembling as he reached for his water. Across the room, Congressman I. Rusk leaned toward Braddock, whispering through gritted teeth. Braddock didn't reply. He just stared straight ahead, jaw set. Even they knew. Justice Clarence Thomas, long considered untouchable, had just made a mistake on record, and Crockett hadn't yelled. She hadn't accused. She hadn't made personal. She'd simply asked what needed to be asked, and when he tried to talk around it, she let the silence speak for itself. But while the room tried to move on, Crockett was already looking ahead, because the next phase wasn't about ethics violations anymore. It was about influence, dark money, and just how deep the rabbit hole went. The committee was now behind schedule, but no one dared to rush it. The hallway outside buzzed with press badges and whispered phone calls. Inside, the chamber's mood had shifted completely. This wasn't just another oversight hearing anymore. Everyone could feel it, even those trying hardest not to show it. Thomas sat quietly, shoulders drawn inward, his earlier composure replaced by something fragile. You could almost hear his thoughts. How much more to reveal? How much less to say? Then Chair Halloran called on Crockett again for a final round of questioning. She didn't rush. She didn't grandstand. She simply pulled the mic closer and said softly, "Let's talk about influence." Somewhere in the back, a camera operator instinctively leaned forward. "We've covered your personal connections," she began. "Your wife's involvement in post-election activity, the missing disclosures. But now, I want to ask you about something more systemic." She locked eyes with Thomas. "Justice Thomas, are you familiar with the Concord Foundation?" There was a pause. Then carefully he replied, "Yes." Crockett continued, her voice deliberate. "For the record, it's a non-profit that has funneled millions into shaping judicial nominations and funding legal strategies for ideologically aligned outcomes." And with that, the next battle line was drawn. Crockett leaned in, her voice calm but sharpened to a fine edge. "You've spoken at their events. You've praised their work. So, Justice Thomas, do you believe it's ethical for a sitting Supreme Court justice to be closely associated with organizations that submit amicus briefs to the very court you serve on?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. Finally he spoke, measured but defensive. "I don't believe association is the same as bias." Crockett nodded slowly. Her reply came soft, but deliberate. Influence doesn't always arrive with a check. Sometimes it comes with applause, with proximity, with a quiet nod of agreement behind closed doors. Thomas stayed silent. Crockett flipped to another page in her folder, her voice tightening as she read, "Since 2012, your name has appeared, directly or indirectly, in reports tied to groups funded by donors whose cases ended up in front of this court. In some instances, those cases were decided 5-4, and you were in the majority." Thomas bristled, his tone firming. "Are you suggesting I was bought?" Crockett shook her head slowly. "No, I'm saying that public trust in your decisions is at risk when money and influence seem to shadow your rulings. That's not just a perception problem. That's an integrity crisis." The word hung in the air like a dropped gavel. "Crisis." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Crockett didn't let the silence last. "There's a reason why people across this country are losing faith in institutions, because the rules don't feel like they apply to everyone. Because the more power someone has, the harder it is to hold them accountable." She leaned forward slightly, not to intimidate, but to connect. "I don't care what party you vote for. I don't care where you worship or what flag you fly, but if you wear that black robe and expect the American people to accept your rulings as final, you have to hold yourself to a standard they can believe in." Thomas's face stayed unreadable, but his silence spoke louder than words. Across the room, committee members looked stunned, not by what Crockett said, but how she said it. Measured, calm, deliberate. No grandstanding, no theatrics. Even the chair didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Des Moines, a single mother named Kayla Shelton watched the hearing on her phone during her lunch break. She wasn't usually into politics, but this felt different. She texted her sister, She's saying everything people like us have been thinking for years. Inside the hearing room, Crockett closed her folder and asked one final question. Justice Thomas. If the roles were reversed, if it were a liberal justice married to a politically active spouse, involved in an effort to overturn an election, and who failed to disclose key financial ties, would you be calling for accountability? The room went still. Thomas stared at her, held her gaze, and finally said, softly, probably. It wasn't loud, it wasn't shouted, but the sound of that word rippled like an earthquake. Several staffers froze. Reporters stopped mid-sentence. Even Crockett, for a split second, looked caught off guard. She recovered quickly, nodding once. Thank you. She turned off her mic. Done. And that was the moment. The precise second when everything changed. Because Justice Clarence Thomas, a man who had built an entire public persona around silence and stoicism, had just admitted, on record, that his own standard of accountability would differ if the situation were reversed. Crack in the armor, small, but undeniable. The hearing adjourned at 3:40 p.m., but the real storm didn't wait for the gavel. It had already erupted outside, on phones, in newsrooms, and all across social media. Thomas's quiet admission was, now loud everywhere, probably. That one word was playing on loop across CNN, NBC, and MSNBC. Fox tried to spin it as hypothetical, but the internet didn't care. Within minutes, hashtags were trending. Probably Gate, recuse now. Crockett vs. Thomas by 4:00 p.m. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's questioning had been viewed over 11 million times. Inside the Capitol, staffers scrambled to coordinate statements. Reporters swarmed Crockett as she left the chamber. She walked slowly, calmly, saying little more than, I asked what needed to be asked. One reporter from the Hill pushed forward. Congresswoman, did you expect Justice Thomas to say what he said? Crockett stopped, thought for a moment, and smiled. Just slightly. I expected him to answer. I didn't expect him to admit. Do you have that single clip crossed 3 million views before sunset? Damage control. Meanwhile, Thomas's team went into full damage control. His longtime legal advisor, Landon Tress, called into 3 major networks, insisting this was hypothetical. Justice Thomas was not making a legal admission. But no one was buying it. In Baltimore, a group of civil rights lawyers watched the footage in their conference room. One of them, Kamari Ellis, stood up slowly and said, this isn't just a PR moment. This could shift how the public talks about the court. In Sacramento, retired Judge Elaine Hartman was asked on local news whether Crockett had crossed the line. Her answer was simple. No. She asked the questions every other public official has been too afraid to ask. By evening, the Washington Post published a piece titled, The Day Crockett Broke the Silence. Politico followed with another, Crockett's Questioning. Could redefine judicial accountability. But what hit hardest wasn't the headlines. It was the people. By nightfall, thousands of messages flooded Crockett's office, emails, calls, even handwritten notes dropped off at her Dallas district headquarters. Not all of them were polite. Some were vicious, even threatening, but most were grateful. One voicemail in particular was played again and again in Crockett's office that night. A voicemail played softly in Crockett's office, again and again. My name is Florence Powell, 72 years old. I watched every minute of that hearing. I cried when he said probably, because I've lived long enough to know. Men like him never say those words, unless they're cornered. Thank you, Congresswoman. By sunrise, the ripple effects had become waves. Advocacy groups mobilized overnight. Several ethics watchdogs filed formal requests, urging the House Judiciary Committee to open an investigation into Clarence Thomas's failure to recuse himself from post-election cases. The American Bar Association released a statement, cautious but firm, calling for a reevaluation of ethical standards for sitting justices, and behind closed doors, the whispers grew louder. A handful of progressive senators met privately, discussing the possibility of drafting a public letter demanding Clarence Thomas recused himself from all upcoming election-related cases. It was bold, possibly symbolic, but the fact that it was even on the table was unprecedented. The silence that spoke volumes as for Thomas. No cameras, no public comment, no statement, just silence. But this silence wasn't calming. It was damning. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett was already 2 steps ahead. In an off-the-record huddle with a handful of trusted aides, she spoke quietly but firmly. He's not the only one. We're going to keep pulling this thread. The robe doesn't make you untouchable. One young staffer whispered nervously, "What if they try to come after you?" Crockett didn't even blink. They already have. That's not new. What's new is that the public's finally watching. And now, they're not looking away. That night, she declined every major network interview. No Sunday talk shows, no panel debates, no political theater. Instead, she released a 90-second video from her office desk. No flashy graphics, no dramatic music. Just her, speaking directly into the camera. "I asked the questions because no one else was. I didn't do it for the cameras. I'm not doing it for fame. I did it because trust in our institutions is crumbling, and trust doesn't rebuild itself." By midnight, the video had crossed 8 million views, but the next morning the narrative shifted again, because up until now, Ginny Thomas, the justice's wife and central figure in Crockett's questioning, had stayed silent. At 9:07 a.m., that changed. Reporters, staffers, committee members, legal analysts, all of their inboxes lit up at once. A press release from the law office of Winston and Parrish, representing Virginia Ginny Thomas. The subject line, "Enough is enough." Inside, the language was sharp, defensive, calculated, designed to sting. Mrs. Thomas categorically denies any wrongdoing, ethical breaches, or coordination with her husband regarding election-related matters. The attempt to weaponize her lawful political expression against Justice Thomas is reckless, defamatory, and a violation of basic American values. But it didn't stop there. The statement accused Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of launching a personal crusade against the Thomases, calling her actions politically motivated and steeped in partisan resentment. And then came the line that changed everything. Mrs. Thomas is prepared to testify under oath, if called upon by the proper committee, in defense of her name, her conduct, and her constitutional rights. By 9 a.m., every major outlet had picked it up. CNN's banner screamed, "Ginny Thomas offers to testify." The New York Times posted a breaking headline by 10 E's. Fox News spun it differently, calling the hearing an ambush and a setup. But Crockett, unshaken, swarmed by reporters outside her office just after 10 a.m. She stopped briefly, looked straight into the cameras and said, "If Mrs. Thomas wants to testify under oath, we welcome that. Because this isn't about personal politics. It's about transparency. It's about accountability. Things the public has been denied for far too long." In a Pittsburgh classroom, civics teacher Andre Young paused his morning lesson and streamed the press conference live. Dozens of students, most of whom had never watched a congressional hearing before this week, sat silently. One finally whispered, "Yo, this is actually real." It was real, and getting more serious by the hour. Behind the scenes, Crockett's staff was already coordinating with legal experts to prepare a formal follow-up. If Ginny Thomas wanted to testify, they'd take her up on it. But it would be on their terms. No closed-door sessions, no prearranged talking points, no softball questions. It had to be public. That night, Crockett gathered in her D.C. apartment with a small circle of advisors. No media. No aides. Just a few legal minds she trusted most. One warned her carefully. Don't push too hard. Let her walk into it. Let her speak first. Crockett nodded slowly, swirling her tea. She wants the attention. Fine. Let's give her the stage. Across town, Ginny's legal team was preparing her narrative, crafting sound bites, rehearsing rebuttals, planning what they thought would be a controlled media moment. Their mistake wasn't arrogance. It was underestimating how precisely Crockett had been building her case. This wasn't about trapping Ginny. It was about drawing a map from her role in post-election chaos to the emails sent to state legislators, to the money trails linking her nonprofit advocacy to legal influence. Piece by piece, Crockett's team was assembling something far bigger than Ginny expected. By now, the public appetite had shifted. This wasn't just about ethics anymore. It was about legitimacy. About how deep unelected influence could reach inside the highest court in the land. Cable segments erupted that evening. Pundits clashed. Some praised Ginny for calling the bluff. Others warned she was walking straight into a political buzzsaw. But something else was happening too. More women started speaking up. Late that night, a former law clerk from 2006 posted on X. A post appeared on X, formerly Twitter, from a former Supreme Court law clerk, 2006. We were always told to stay out of the Thomas orbit. Everyone knew Ginny was involved in more than she let on. Hours later, an ex-staffer from a prominent legal advocacy group spoke anonymously to The Guardian. There were real concerns about coordination between Ginny's lobbying and Supreme Court calendars. We were told that don't leave anything sensitive in writing. Whispers, allegations. Now finding the light, and behind all of it, Jasmine Crockett. Methodical, quiet, strategic. She wasn't celebrating, she wasn't smiling. She was working, because Crockett understood something crucial. This story wasn't going to end with one headline, and as the media swirled and lawyers sharpened their tools, the streets began to stir. Because the public was no longer waiting for verdicts, they were showing up. By Friday afternoon, the energy had shifted out of Washington and onto the streets. In dozens of cities, big and small, people weren't just talking. They were moving, organizing, gathering. Outside the Supreme Court building in D.C., a small crowd formed by early evening. Quiet at first, just signs, candles, and curious passers-by. But by nightfall, more than 3,000 people had filled the sidewalks. Some held candles. Others held pocket constitutions. Many carried signs with a single, searing quote. Would you call for accountability? Clarence Thomas's probably had become a rallying cry. In Columbus, Ohio, law students and professors held a teach-in on judicial ethics on the courthouse steps. In Austin, Texas, activists set up a giant outdoor screen, looping Crockett's questioning on repeat downtown. In Tucson, an elderly woman named Gloria brought folding chairs and water bottles to a local park, encouraging strangers to sit, watch, and talk. This wasn't a protest in the traditional sense. It was deeper, more personal. People weren't screaming, they were questioning, they were sharing stories. They were trying to understand how something so powerful had been allowed to operate in the shadows for so long. Reactions poured in across party lines. Former federal prosecutor Avery Rollins told NPR, "This is less about party politics and more about public expectations, when even the Supreme Court appears to operate under a different set of rules. Democracy begins to fracture." Even late-night shows handled it with rare seriousness. Comedian Trevor Norris, usually known for satire, opened his monologue with a solemn tone. When one woman's questions can rattle the highest court in the land, we have to ask ourselves, who's really holding the power? And who's been holding their breath, waiting to speak? In Kansas City, a Sunday sermon went off script. Pastor Lewis Caldwell addressed his congregation. "I'm not here to tell you who to vote for, but when I see someone speak truth to power with a steady voice and nothing to gain, I call that leadership." Even conservative outlets were splintered. Some defended Thomas, accusing Crockett of politicizing the judiciary, but others, like the American Law Review, published an editorial that stunned readers. Public service at the highest levels demands more than silence. The American people have every right to question impartiality when the appearance of impropriety is this loud. Ginny Thomas escalates by. Saturday afternoon, Ginny Thomas's legal team released another statement, this time adding a careful twist. Her testimony, if requested, would be contingent on terms that preserve her constitutional rights and the dignity of her private affairs. But the damage was already done, because this wasn't just another political outrage cycle. This was bigger, deeper, uncontainable. It wasn't just about one justice failing to disclose. It was about millions of Americans realizing, maybe for the first time, that the court had become a place where power answered only to itself. Over the weekend, Crockett stayed silent. No appearances, no interviews, no tweets. Her office released a single short statement Saturday night. Congresswoman Crockett thanks the public for their engagement and their voices. She remains committed to ensuring transparency and accountability, no matter where the questions lead. In Jackson, Mississippi, a grandmother named Lucinda printed that statement and taped it to her front door. In Santa Rosa, California, a high school history teacher played Crockett's clip for his class, then asked, "What happens when people finally start paying attention?" A student, barely 17, replied softly, "Feels like they can't hide behind the robe anymore." By Sunday night, major polling firms were already detecting a shift. A Gallup flash poll showed trust in the Supreme Court had dropped 12 points in just 5 days. Another poll showed 76% of Americans, across party lines, now believed justices should be subject to stricter financial disclosure rules. Back in D.C., quiet conversations were turning into planning sessions, because what started as a few pointed questions was beginning to shake the foundations of something far older and far more protected than most Americans had ever dared to question. And then came Monday. A strange anticipation hung over Washington, an anxious stillness across government offices, newsrooms, and the homes of millions who had followed the hearings like a courtroom drama they never expected to care about. Clarence Thomas was back in the headlines. That morning, the Supreme Court issued a rare public notice, not from Thomas himself, but from the court's Public Information Office. Justice Thomas will not be making a personal statement at this time. All judicial duties continue as scheduled, sterile, precise. And yet the words landed like a brick. No acknowledgement of the hearing, no clarification, no attempt to repair the damage. Silence. But this wasn't the kind of silence that calms a nation. This was the kind that ignites it. By noon, Jasmine Crockett had already drafted a formal request to the House Judiciary Committee, a call to introduce legislation requiring mandatory financial disclosures for all Supreme Court justices. With it came clear penalties for non-compliance. No more self-policing. No more clerical oversights. Her accompanying statement read less like a proposal and more like a warning. Accountability shouldn't depend on whether the public is watching. Integrity is not optional. If the highest court in the land can operate without checks, then our democracy isn't being protected. It's being performed. This wasn't just a political moment. It was a cultural one. Across social platforms, people weren't arguing left versus right anymore. They were talking about power, who has it, how they keep it, and who's brave enough to question it. Students shared clips of Crockett's calm, surgical questioning. Veterans spoke about service, sacrifice, and what the Constitution truly means. Teachers turned the hearing into civics case studies, weaving the exchange into lesson plans across the country. And through it all, one idea kept rising above the noise. This could have gone unnoticed, if not for one person who refused to back down. Because this wasn't just about Clarence Thomas, Ginny Thomas, or even the technicalities of disclosure forms and amicus briefs. It was about how easily we let institutions drift into shadow when no one is brave or stubborn enough to turn on the light. Jasmine Crockett didn't storm in shouting. She didn't attack. She simply asked questions, simple ones. Did you disclose this? Did you recuse when appropriate? Did you talk to your wife about matters affecting this nation? Would you expect others to be held accountable under the same conditions? Questions that most Americans could answer in a heartbeat, and yet when power can't or won't answer them, that's when you know something is broken. The people watching, they felt that. They didn't need law degrees. They didn't need to understand every technicality. They just needed someone to say it out loud. In a small town in Oklahoma, a retired coal miner told his grandson, "That lady in Congress, she made me feel like someone finally gives a damn." In Oakland, a first-year law student scribbled in her notebook, "I don't want to be a lawyer who wins. I want to be a lawyer who matters." These are the echoes that grow louder when the right words are spoken at the right time. Not flashy, not poetic, just brave. So where does this go next? That depends on who keeps paying attention. Justice Clarence Thomas is still on the bench. Ginny Thomas still hasn't testified. The court, for now, continues on, but it's no longer untouchable because now there are eyes on it, millions of them. And that might be the most powerful check this court has faced in decades. Jasmine Crockett isn't a celebrity. She's not trying to be. She's a lawyer, a legislator, a woman who decided that when it was her turn to speak, she wouldn't waste it, and she didn't. In a sea of noise, she used silence like a scalpel, calm words that cut deep. And in doing so, she reminded this country of something we almost forgot. Courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly behind a microphone, opens a folder, and refuses to pretend that everything's fine. And if you're still watching, if you're still asking questions, then this story, it's not over. It's just beginning. Because real accountability doesn't come from the top down. It comes from people like you, watching, listening, voting, speaking up. So keep watching, keep asking, and if you believe this kind of courage matters, share the story, tell a friend, start conversation. Push for better. This country belongs to the people who demand better from it. Let's make sure they keep hearing us.